Today, I want to talk about the latest University of Liverpool's poll. It's the third in a series of four. Um, the next one is scheduled for the last week of the election campaign. Um, it was covered in the Irish News on Monday, and they're continuing to look at some of the really interesting detail a bit later on, but I'll come back to that later on. Also, there's a great analysis from our own deputy editor, David McCann. Now, in broad brush strokes, in terms of party politics, after nearly 20 years of the DUP Sinn Féin duopoly dominating Northern Irish politics, the ground appears to be shifting under their feet. The two former extremes now seem to be destined for a definite fork in the road, if not a complete breakup. Predictions are difficult, but in the past we've seen that poll ratings at the start of a campaign tend to describe relatively accurately where the parties will be at the end of it. However, this has been less the case in recent years, and there are some signs of volatility here that could emerge during the next few weeks of the campaign. Overall, to quote the Institute of Irish Studies from their own website, Sinn Féin are on course to be the largest party. I think that's indisputable. But it also notes that the share for parties other than the DUP and Sinn Féin has generally grown, in some cases more than others, and that should lead to the two largest parties losing some seats, or at least not gaining any. So neither of the two big two seem set to rise or to increase their seat totals. However, in the case of Sinn Féin, the drop between 2017 and now is less than 1%, whereas the drop for the DUP is a full 8%. Now, that's due to a sharp rise in terms of the present series of polls in the Sinn Féin vote, who are almost back to their record 2017 figure. Now, looking back further from February, which is when the last one was, to November, when Alliance hit 17%, the Sinn Féin surge might be being fuelled by people who had intended to vote Alliance, perhaps, to give Naomi Long their endorsement, but who are increasingly keen to see the DUP defenestrated as residual holders of the First Minister's role. So if we were to look at that 8-point gap and to extrapolate no further substantial change, then the First Minister's job looks absolutely nailed on for Sinn Féin and Michelle O'Neill. However, there are a number of complicating factors and that we should look at before hanging out the bunting for Ms O'Neill and Sinn Féin. Firstly, when you keep in the undecided and won't vote figures and give out the core figures of those who say they will definitely vote for one party or another, then Sinn Féin come top at 20%, the DUP just 15%, and in the middle, the undecided account for fully 17.2%, which nominally puts them in second place. That's about 3% down from February, but it still represents a very big chunk of people who have yet to make their minds up. On the Unionist side, a lot of people will be trying to figure out whether it's worth giving the DUP one more chance to make it work, or go to the TUV on one side, who have doubled their rating from 2017, or put Doug Beattie in and give him a chance to prove himself as an alternative leader of unionism. Now, given the margin of error is plus or minus 3.1%, there's not much sign of life around either the Ulster Unionists or the SDLP at the moment. The biggest winners so far is a 5.5% leap in the first preferences for the Alliance Party, putting them at 14.6. That is marginally ahead of the Ulster Unionists and nearly 5 points up on the SDLP, neither of whom really move very much in this poll or even even in previous ones. The second factor is the rate at which voters are likely to transfer, and to who and from whom. This is where perhaps we're going to see a deeper trend, and it's uniform on both sides of the communal divide. Amongst DUP First Preference voters, nearly 50% of all transfers are going out to the Ulster Unionists, but when you look at the Ulster Unionists' second preferences, only 17 is going in the other direction towards the DUP. The biggest number is 31%, and that's going directly to Alliance. 20% to the TUV, and a tiny, compared to 2017, transfer rate to the SDLP. Looking at the Sinn Féin, again, what you've got is 50% of transfers out going to the SDLP, with a few going out to Alliance and some to the Greens. Second preference is from the SDLP, however, and most of its transfers are going to Alliance at 43%, with only 15% returning to Sinn Féin. Now, Michael has written on Slugger that there should be some caveats, and I think what we need to be careful about here is that there's always some kind of balance in the selection of people who answer any polling questions. So it may be that what we're getting here is a sort of a Belfast or urban-centric reading that doesn't necessarily take account of where things are out in the rural countryside. But there's no proof of that, and there will be no proof until we actually get to the counting process. But however, having said that, what we might be seeing here, given the overwhelming trends, is a dynamic which is starting to draw people back towards the centre ground. So yes, they're voting in big numbers for Sinn Féin, and it looks like whatever happens, the DUP in terms of vote share will probably come in second. I don't see any growth in the Ulster Unionists, and there's no sense that Alliance can make up that, at least in one election. Perhaps over two or three, that's possible. In getting back up to 27% of the vote, Sinn Féin has barely lifted a finger compared to the wall-to-wall crocodile references of the last time out. So we can say with some certainty that their high rating has very little to do with tribalised rhetoric, and much more to do with anger and disappointment within unionism with the DUP. Its failure, I think, to deliver on promises around Brexit and the protocol, and in government, and its record in government in general. When you look at the ratings of ministers, the bottom four are all in the DUP. Unionist voters no longer believe that voting against Sinn Féin, I think, provides them with any worthwhile return on their investment. And they're no longer worried, really, I think, about a Sinn Féin First Minister. They're not really worried about a United Ireland, but that's another conversation to have about the data further down in the poll. Far from being the bigots of nationalist caricature, Unionists may be considering what's more important, to keep someone out or to send a message to the lead Unionist party that what they're doing is no longer good enough. And when you consider that 10 years ago, peace was still at a premium and people would bury all manner of social grievance for the sake of communal solidarity, I think that represents quite a substantial and important shift if it's borne out in the election results. This was even the case 5 years ago when the DUP took as much as 29% of the vote in order to keep Sinn Féin out. Back then it was popular because of Sinn Féin's espousal of the IRA's campaign of violence back in the 70s, 80s and 90s. But more to the point, the party's social conservatism has opened up a gap, I think, which it may find hard to close when you consider where wider unionism finds itself in relation to major social issues. So, for instance, some 61% of unionists, 80% of nationalists and 86% of neithers now support marriage equality. And actually, neithers and unionists are actually more supportive of the right to abortion than nationalists are, who only enjoy a 49% approval of such issues. In any normal democracy, when you come that far adrift of where your base is, then you're absolutely in trouble. And it looks to me like that's exactly the sort of trouble the DUP is currently in. And if that holds, it might actually be quite hopeful for everyone else. If Sinn Féin is legitimately elected as First Minister and the sky doesn't fall in, as I suspect it won't, then that stops Sinn Féin USP for the DUP potentially is busted for any future elections. But there's still some questions. Sinn Féin is comfortably ahead on first preferences, but the largest influx of transfers are set to come from the tiny people before profit, and the Greens, with just 16% of SDLP voters planning to choose Sinn Féin as a second transfer. So it may struggle in some of the lower end battles for fourth and fifth place seats. The DUP, on the other hand, and this may surprise some, even though it shouldn't, because as recently as 2016 they could pull on the loyalties of some 30% of the whole Northern Irish population, well, they remain relatively transfer friendly, so, at least relative to Sinn Féin. So For now, it's pushing on with the old Stop the Sinn Féin um, rhetoric in the hopes of holding on to Unionist transfers or perhaps some kind of voting booth conversion on the day when people contemplate a Sinn Féin First Minister. Alliance is just above the margin of error from last November's rating. That was the first in this series of polls, but the polling is still 5% above the 9% it got in 2017. So to make use of all of those great transfers it seems to be set to take from the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists, it will want to hold on to that expanded share of first preference votes to maximise the number of seats it's able to get and the geographical spread thereof. The Ulster Unionists last time round lost 6 seats despite their vote share actually going up, and at the moment they seem to be up on that particular vote share. In terms of transfers this time they seem set to take a lot more DUP transfers, but like the SDLP, the bulk of their transfers on are going out to Alliance. And that's going to make for some very interesting stories, I think, on the 2 days on which the count takes place. In contrast, the SDLP managed to hold on to all their seats back in 2017 on a relatively steady vote share. I think it was slightly down, but in the polls so far they've yet to reach the 12% they got back then. That's all within the margin of error, so if the patterns of the 2019 elections hold, what we may see is some of their seats go and other ones come in, depending on candidate strength. And I suspect that's going to make predicting the SDLP performance most difficult. I think they have put a lot of effort into trying to get good candidates, younger candidates, who may well have a local impact that is hard to judge, and may not rely on the overall ratings of the party. Anyway, that's all for me today. Hopefully I will get round to looking at some of the more interesting detail, the social detail, and some really interesting results on the desirability of United Ireland. But until then, thank you very much and thank you for watching. Please do subscribe to the Slugger O'Toole subscribe button just by ringing the little bell, and you can keep in touch